I would like to speak today about how these futures become socially performative, and I like to kick this off with this picture. I mean, it's one of the most circulated pictures of environmental history, recent environmental history, and it's often also connected to Laurent Fabius saying the famous words of l'accord de Paris du climat est accepté. And then the next moment you see actually Al Gore in tears, all the world leaders in tears, because they have achieved something. And it's a claim on the future. And I want to sort of unpack that claim on the future a bit and share with you some of the collective work that we do in the Urban Future Studio of Utrecht University. Because what we try and do is to create an empirical approach to understanding how futures become socially performative. And the funny thing is about this Accord of Paris is that while everybody was in tears, probably they should have been in tears for the fact that it was not actually a prediction that this was going to be all right this time. Here you see the CO2 levels going up and nicely positioned with all the previous conferences and agreements. And here's, of course, the famous bathtub that shows you how much CO2 we can still emit. And the whole point about the carbon budget, which obviously was the discursive invention to put this message, drive this message home, that carbon budget is very limited still, if you want to stick to the 2 degree or even the 1.5 degree target. And if you look at carbon also in terms of social inequality, it's even more terrible. We've just seen the drought, the floods in Pakistan, and obviously that is the bottom 50% that hasn't emitted any CO2, hardly any CO2, whereas the top 1% are, of course, heavily emitting carbon and still continue to do so. But I want to use that case of the environment to speak a bit about the future, and there's a particular paper in which we try to position our work on futuring in the social theoretical journals. It was just to test whether it would hold, whether people would accept that you can make sense of the future, and that's where you can read this all back. Now, happily I follow on Felix, who basically said much of the same stuff that I intended to say, so I can rush through this. So, because the future is obviously a strange topic to study, right? It is not there, so how can you study it? So but you can, of course, because it's very active in terms of the images of the future in the present, and these can be studied empirically. We cannot study the future, but we can study claims about the future in the present. And the source for that, I was happily hearing Andy referring to Fred Pollack, I suppose is Pollack, who did a ridiculously detailed analysis of how the future featured in previous sort of stages of Western civilization, I should say, because the future obviously is not something that everybody is equally concerned with, but is definitely an element of modern society. We are a future-oriented culture in that sense. But the future is also about imagination. So how is it possible that people have these ideas about the future? Where are they derived from? And in social science circles, we would say it's a collective endeavor. We have collectivized images of the future, and that's why we broadly through the disciplines use this concept, for instance, of the imaginary. The anthropologists use it, geographers use it, political scientists, sociologists use it in different ways, obviously. But the imaginary is a sort of collectively held image of a possible future or even a desirable future, very interestingly. Now, what I suggest to say is always you talk about futures in the plural because it is always about choice, it's about power, whose future is, hegemonic over other futures. And secondly, it is an activity. So futuring makes the future into a verb. So what we study is how you future, how you are actively working on futures. And that's different, I suppose, of future studies. That's much more about predicting or about expected futures, but I'll come back to that later on. I'll share with you a few definitions. So futuring, I would then argue, is the attempt to shape the space for action by identifying and circulating images of the future, a process by which relationship between past, present and future are enacted. So I would insist, despite the fact that I realize that past, present and future in decolonial discourses is problematic, I would insist on using that because it is, in the context of environmental politics, very important to see how you narrate that relationship between past, present and future. One of the interesting social theoretical texts coming from Germany in this debate, I think, is Jens Beckert, who did a good sort of industrial sociological analysis of how the future features in the world of the economy. And of course, I mean, if you imagine a banker, I mean, how would a banker choose whether or not to give a loan to an entrepreneur without having what Jens Beckers called a fictional expectation? I mean, of course there are facts, you do your calculations, you need to also suggest it's also rigid and rigorous, but it is in the end a fictional expectation about future returns that makes that you as a banker give out a loan, and obviously for the entrepreneur the same. It's a fictional expectation that you get it right this time. So that notion of fictional expectations, I think, is very interesting. And it does something to us epistemologically, because many of our sort of social science colleagues would say, well, fiction, stay away from it, right? But the point of futuring is that you need to connect facts and fictions, because that is how these future visions become socially performative. So we need to open up also the fact that fictions are what we study in their interrelationship with facts. How to do that? And so what we suggest to use is a concept called techniques of futuring. So then what you actually study are the practices that bring together actors around one or more imagined futures, and through which they come to share particular orientations for action. So cost-benefit analysis. I would say a cost-benefit analysis is a tool in which allows parliaments, for instance, to invest massively in a motorway because they have been assured by economists that the return will be higher than the investment, and that the investment upfront is worth it. But that's the tool. I think what we do if we analyze it as a technique of futuring is to see in what context that tool is operational. So the fact that Parliament then says, well, because the cost-benefit analysis was positive, we now agree with the motorway extension. Yeah? And of course we can go into the cost-benefit analysis and look how they actually made it positive, which is often what happens when it comes to motorways. Now the second thing what I need as a tool in the toolkit to analyze the social performativity of futures is dramaturgical analysis. And I started my career with lots of work on discourse, and I still insist that discourse is crucial, so that we, through language, make these claims about the future. But I want to be more precise in how you position where these texts come from, because that has explanatory value. So in these books, you see it sort of evolve from discourse analysis to the 2009 book, where I connected to political dramaturgies. And political dramaturgy is not something new to political science, but it is a really minority position. So Murray Edelman in the 1960s was, of course, somebody who invoked the theater as for the analysis of politics. And what you then would do is to look at the art of making dramas and placing them properly on the stage. And then you have to look at the dramaturgical composition and representation. And well, that's the first sort of attempt. We can go back to Laurent Fabius. I mean, it was a fantastically staged event, and it was definitely making political drama. I like it to be simple, so you can basically analyze who says what. You look at persons, how things are said through discourses or frames, where things are being said, the stages, the site, the mise en scène, how they organize these said, and to whom things are being said. And then there is this difference between the idea That's sort of the common sense idea of an audience that exists, and the sort of pragmatist idea of us as social scientists that that's actually not the case, but through the act you create the public, right? So it is not, it is latently there, but through the enactment of your future, people go along and you create a shared imaginary. This is the more detailed and analytical scheme of what we now call a dramaturgical regime, in which we connect then all the previous components. Now let's go back to environmental politics. So here, obviously, we have a rehearsed staging of the political. And I suppose we sometimes tend to underappreciate how journalists in their mediatized reporting actually like things being rehearsed. They like to reproduce that what they already know. The suggestion that they're looking for news is actually wrong. They like routines, and routine-like behavior, that is indeed what we have been rehearsing in environmental politics ever since 1972, when we had the first Earth Summit in Stockholm, which we celebrated this year its 50th anniversary of. But we say, well, actually, that rehearsed dramaturgy of the environmental political is problematic in itself, because it is a confined space in which particular futures can be legitimately brought to the fore and others are excluded. And that process of bias, we heard about Schatzscheider earlier in this conference, that idea about the mobilization of bias in the dramaturgy is then the empirical object for us to bring out as social scientists. And if you want to sort of be popular, you find, of course, the phrases that express this. And that argues we see summit theater. I said, well, there's a reality of cockpitism, the illusion that we have a cockpit on the planet, the spaceship metaphor, and that these conferences are a cockpit in which we steer the direction of planetary politics. And you can at least say, well, let's analyze the choreography of that idea of centralized decision making. Now, when I say this, I'm not belittling the Paris Agreement. I think it is absolutely crucial. I think because of its discursive power, it organizes the fictional expectation and the orientation space in which firms organize their futures. So in that sense, it is politically very active, but not by the idea that politics in that cockpit organizes the political. Being a political science, being the political scientist in the room, or at least of today, I want to sort of also position that in the three sort of key concepts that we use as political scientists to analyze politics. So there's always this relationship between the polity, so that the unity in which we create politics, the policy as the set of instruments to act upon decisions, and then politics as, well, what Easton called it, the binding allocation of values. And I think if you look back at how that happens in environmental politics, you see a confinement of the political. And the confinement is that it is created in a theater in which ecological modernization still is the language you have to use in order to meaningfully speak about the environment. So it's not about more radical notions, and I will go into details how they pre-orchestrate the political decision-making, in particular using modeling, modeling of the future. And you could say that that is also a domain in which, as a political scientist, you could look at the way in which it captures the political. So that actually we build in the fact that we are unable to really develop the sort of politics that match a world with limited climate change. And the two theories that I think are important to invoke in that context, sort of more radical political theorists, are Chantal Mouffe and Jacques Rancière, who would insist on this message, so that any set of procedures has an exclusionary effect, and that the political is always also fighting back. So that I mean, it's not as if it's okay to express yourself and you're left alone. No, the political manifests itself and is fighting back when there are other utterances that do not fit the dominant model of the political. So I'm fascinated, for instance, in that regard. Why is it that Extinction Rebellion, where predominantly young people and actually also older people are so concerned that they take to the street and lie down, that is met with violence? Why is that? Well, I think because they strike a nerve of something about the inaction of the political that then needs to be policed. It needs to be taken off as illegitimate because it undermines the effectiveness or the illusion of effectiveness of the political center. And the alternative that movement expresses is agonistic democracy, which is this notion of politics which allows conflicts much more in its center and allows much more debate and is less concerned with concerted politics like in climate agreements. And let me go back to the dramaturgical regime. I mean, in the remainder of my talk, I will focus on one aspect that I have singled out in that analysis, and that is the way in which science defines the future in environmental politics. And of course, we use the term the science policy interface for that. So just imagine, we have the UNFCCC, that's the UN treaty on climate change, and that commits all countries, that's us, to limiting climate change. But what have you set up in parallel is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that basically does, group all the peer-reviewed articles that we write together and say, well, this is the state of climate knowledge. And of course, they also run scenarios. They run the SSP scenarios. And now it's very interesting to look into what is allowed into these scenarios, how they construct the political in these scenarios. So first of all, you have to realize that we are hardly in these reports. It's the natural sciences that dominate Working Group 1. Geographers are in Working Group 2 about the effects of climate change, and then Working Group 3 is about mitigation. There are now lifestyle concerns are part of that, but it's minute. The natural science definition of the future is the one that is dominant in that context. And at the summaries, and you find that the natural science language defines the future. But now what is interesting, if you then look deeper into how these models are run, you get to see how natural science and the political interact. Let's go back to Paris. There are these island states that say, well, we are a member of the United Nations. And is it true that the scientists say that if we will go to 2 degrees, that we no longer exist? Well, that's a constitutional crisis. So the UN needed to have a scenario that would allow these nation states to still exist and be a member of the United Nations. So what did they ask the modelers? They say, can you run a scenario in which the sea level rise is not so high that these island states will disappear? But that was really difficult because by all means they realized that was not very likely. So what they invented was negative emissions. A mysterious new procedure in which you would actually capture the CO2 that you emit and you put it under the ground. You could reforest, you could use biomass, put it in a power station and create negative emissions. And look at that illusion that we created with ourselves. We're not doing it now. We have about 10 CSS operating plants. They're all experimental. And in the scenarios after 2040, we will really get on with it. And we will suddenly turn that curve. So we call that political calibration. So you know that about the calibration of models. If the model doesn't actually perform precisely as you know the world performs, you calibrate it. I must have something wrong in the parameter. You calibrate the model. We know about that, and it's a worrying practice. But that's how we model and how we work. But apparently there is also political calibration, which is about the interaction between science and politics, in order for the political as it exists to survive. So that is a technique of futuring in its empirical detail. So if you broaden it out, then I suppose you could say ecological modernization, which is the idea that we have the technology basically to resolve our problems, drives on a natural science to define its problems. It suggests that policy making is able to actually change the course of events. Because we want the Americans on board, we need to sort of commit ourselves to market-based instruments, otherwise they will never sign. And there is a belief in technological innovation, CCS I mentioned, but there are many other technological innovations that are crucial. And of course, because the Global South says, hey, wait a minute, you created a problem, we are supposed to stop developing, can we please be compensated for that? So that's the logic in which we operate our climate politics. That's not going to work. It's not going to work. We're not going to get to that 1.5 degree target in this way. I'm not saying that we're not going to bend the curve, but not in this form of the political. We need to broaden our understanding of the political in order to achieve that. So we have to problematize this whole dramaturgy of politics. Because what is the logical consequence of continuing this? And it's already in the debate, is geoengineering. So the idea that we can actually block solar radiation and reduce climate change effects and the heating of the planet. But alas, we then have to temporarily use the world as a laboratory. So it's a risky strategy, and obviously if you also take into account what we previously discussed about private entrepreneurs being interested in space, it's not unlikely that this is not entirely going to be UN coordinated, right? So if this logic is, this is of course sort of arguing the logic of the discourse and the dramaturgy to its logical end, we end up there. What can we then do instead? So let's go back a bit to our business of today, the future elements. How do they feature in how does the future feature in environmental politics? Well, predominantly in terms of expectations. I'm really struck by that. So that we keep on arguing that the way in which to make the future performative in our politics is to say, if we don't act, this is going to happen. And we push the statistics into the face of the citizenry. But why would people then say, well, yes, you're right. We should refrain from driving our car. So the whole genre of possibilities in futuring is used to a very limited degree because it's rehearsed and it's actually also legally embedded. The IPCC delivers its periodic reports. But what it doesn't do, and it's rehearsed in the dramaturgy, what it doesn't do is to actually look at aspirational futures. So the whole idea, could we invest just as much energy, also in the academy, in thinking what sort of society we could create if we would really stick to a 1.5 degree target? Would it be, like Jose discussed yesterday, would it perhaps be better? Would it be more sociable? But why are these images not there? Because we have now sort of created a dramaturgical regime in which the natural sciences in a very particular fashion dominate how we relate to the future. Now this should not come to a surprise. This future cone is the ideal tool for teaching futures. And I always love it when others use it, because often actually the most crucial category is left out. And that's the category of the preposterous. And so but if you look back, of course, that's the fascinating category. Things that in some period are regarded as preposterous, but then suddenly become real. They become the future present. So what we tend to do, of course, is we look for projected futures. We look what's plausible, probable, and preferable. That register is used a lot. But well, okay, let's take the journey to the moon. We do a lot of space stuff in this seminar. Jules Verne, Journey to the Moon, was a preposterous proposition, right? President Kennedy in the early 1960s, we are going to put a man onto the moon, a preferable future. The Apollo project, a projected and executed future, and one small step for man, a giant step for mankind, a shared moment in history. So it just is a silly example to say that the preposterous as a thought space can often, and historically, you see often materialize in a reality. But it's very hard to put into that dramaturgical regime of environmental politics. Now, a more subtle approach to that futures cone is to also bring in the past. And I was really happy, Felix, that you also anticipated that. And as a discourse analyst, I would insist that we can only think about the future using the discourses that have been passed on to us from the past. So it's very difficult to develop a new language that we then use meaningfully to influence our imagination of what could be. So you have traces of the past, and of course that cone of light only illuminates that what can be thought, that can be imagined, using the discourses of the past. So the discursive space and the dramaturgical regime keep us in a stranglehold. And I suppose we sort of think about ways of breaking out. And one of the ways in which I'm convinced that we could break out much better, and there we should learn from the clever folks that dominate the expos in Dubai and so forth, but they know all about aspirations, but the only thing is they do that to sell us a car. So so that's why I like to invite people also from the commercial part of the world to learn how do you tap into the aspirations of people, and why would we not use that much more in environmental politics? Now we are sort of caught in where we are, so that we open up the register of aspirational futures. And create these new bold propositions. Now, looking at the time, I would now like to turn to a small intervention that I did. We've done a few exhibitions as studio, but as part of the International Architectural Biennial, I also orchestrated an experiment, a dramaturgical intervention, to see if I could develop something which, it's not radically different, but within the confines of the dramaturgical regime, if I could shift the imagined futures and create an aspirational future. And it's called the 2050 An Energetic Odyssey. So pun intended. Stanley Kubrick was sort of in my mind at that time. And I'm now going to place the future on the ground. I'll explain how that works. And there's a paper in which we sort of did an auto-ethnography of how we orchestrated this and how we see, how we analyze the impacts. So here is a younger version of myself. So in my previous life, before the Urban Future Study, I was Director General of the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. And the Netherlands Environmental Agency was part of that science policy interface. So in the 7 years of my term, I handed over some 200 reports with assessments to policymakers on all levels. And here's Achim Steiner, who now runs the development program of the UN. And the report, it was actually, we all smiling there, but the report was in Nagoya when they were signing a biodiversity treaty. And the report said, you're not going to reach your goals. But anyway, thank you so much. uh, but I was frustrated because I mean that's the routine in which you operate. I mean a report like that, mind you, is 1.5 million worth of time of researchers, so it's not minute, right? And but that cockpit model that doesn't work. It was a backcast study, and it didn't deliver the imaginary. So here was another backcast. It's a backcast study done by Ecofis. It was an ecological consultancy firm until a few years ago, and they had done a backcast on renewable energy, how to get to renewable targets for 2030 for the European Union. But I was not going to, of course, hand that over. I thought, can we create a dramaturgical overlay that would make that study, that backcast, become performative? And the best way, I thought, was to put it on the ground. So what I did, I collaborated. Okay, that last bit goes really fast. It's a funny system. Anyway, so what I collaborated with a designer, and we created a 8 by 7 or 10 by 7 floor run, basically, the digital run of a scenario in which the North Sea would suddenly move from oil and gas to renewables, building 25,000 10 megawatt windmills. I mean, so that's really a bold proposition. But the point was, of course, not that I put it on the floor, but that I created a moment for these policymakers to share. Oh, sorry, this is going a bit fast. To share that possibility of an imaginary, a shared vision of a desirable future. Because one of the things is why they often don't want to move is that they're afraid that others won't want to move. So collectivizing that experience of an alternative future possibility was the experiment. Now, then I analyzed that policymakers always say, yes, I would want to go, and they then would put their hand on my shoulder and say, Maarten, I would want to go, but I can't because. And so I analyzed as a political scientist what they then said. They said, industry is not ready. So we staged immediately after that presentation, industry saying we are ready. So we anticipated on the first objection that they would have. And then, funnily enough, they say, well, perhaps we should do it. And it was not anticipated, but they created a few possibilities also for the ministers from the European Union to see it. And then they signed in Luxembourg on the 6th June of 2016, an agreement to speed up the build-up of offshore wind on the North Sea. And interestingly, the Dutch minister who championed that at the time, the Dutch were president of the European Union, said, we can do it, we stood around it. So that's, well, I mean, I'm not talking about attribution saying, well, this installation changed the world, but in the much more complicated context of all sorts of other things. Nevertheless, a politician said, so his imaginary became socially performative, also leading to this agreement. This is this last self-indulgent picture. But the point was that, I mean, why could this happen? This could not happen in the theater of the rehearsed dramaturgy, right? It needed soft spaces, so spaces outside the hard spaces of politics. And that was because I was curator of the International Architectural Biennial, that allowed me to create this thing and also allowed me the space to say, well, it's just a biennial. If you don't like it, it's just a biennial. You say it's silly, artists do silly things, right? So I also created the opportunity for politicians to opt out, because they don't want to be cornered. They want always to be seen to choose something. So the opportunity of a quick opt-out was also organized. So to conclude, I think if you really want to think about how these futures become socially performative, you need a theory of time. And I think that sequence of staged events is one how you can analyze politics in general, but how you also could analyze the alternative. If you want to do more on aspirational futures, think about it in theatrical terms as a sequence of staged events that lead to that sharing of an aspirational future. a theory of place, because the hard politics are not going to change so easily. We need to think also in a broader understanding of the political about these soft spaces that we have much more control over, that we can create ourselves, and that may, in a mediatized society, become influential and then as a secondary affect the decision making in the hard spaces. And of course, a theory of dynamics. And my suggestion is to look at futuring in empirical terms of dramaturgy and discourse. That was my story. Thank you.